Hi, this is MarqueeCrew, and I'd like to review a new Crew macro with you, and thank you very much for your subscription to my YouTube channel. The Crew macro that I've created is really a reformatting of the existing Alteryx macro for data cleansing. And what I wanted to do was be able to provide users with the ability to understand what was happening within the macro, but also to perform those functions much faster. It's an observation of mine that the macro would run slowly. When you take a look inside the macro, if you pull back the covers, you'll see that there is code that's being executed repeatedly on literally every record, potentially every field. And so it's asking the data, am I supposed to do something with you? And if I am, then is this what I'm supposed to do with you? And let's try it. And asking so many questions of every record and potentially every field has an overhead. And what I wanted to be able to do was eliminate the overhead. As I pulled back the covers and brought in other people to help me to test, then the decision was made. I need to go and really take a look at all of the functions instead of just some of the functions, and really were able to together come up with some pretty good performance gains that I'm proud to show you. So one of the things that we do when we're looking at executing Alteryx commands or expressions is to only run them when necessary. So instead of asking every record, let's just ask once and only run things when it's necessary. So I'm going to use detours extensively in this macro to be able to avoid logic. So I've already said that the Alteryx macro runs slowly, but I want to qualify that. When you're running small quantities of data, when you're running tens of thousands of records, you might not even notice this. If you're running 100,000 records, you might not notice it. But there was a post asking recently for millions of records, what can I do to run this process faster? In looking at the cleanse macro, there were limited functions. So if you wanted to do something a little bit different, how would I do that? And I'm not going to solve that in the macro except to show you, here's the logic. Now, you've got the logic. If you don't want to remove a certain character, or you don't want to do something exactly as it's done within the cleanse macro, you can take a look at what the cleanse macro does and modify it in a multi-field or formula tool yourself. And one of the functions that I wanted to get into was punctuation cleanup, because if you say you want to remove all punctuation, it's literally all punctuation. And wherever you are in the world, if you're looking at currency, that could be problematic because it could get rid of the decimal or decimal equivalent of commas and periods, and you didn't want to do that. So what did I want to my objective here, what did I want to achieve? Performance of the macro, updating the functions, including some form of regular expression help, and getting the same results. And one other thing that I wanted to do was change the layout from being a horizontal to vertical. That's not going to change the speed or performance of the macro itself. It was just a fun little thing to do. And so I have a lot of friends that are vertical, and I wanted to play on Team Vertical. So let's see what type of performance increases we achieve. As you can read as I'm describing this, there's significant performance achievement that we were able to make, especially when you're using the ability to delete empty rows and columns. So let's take a look at performance and things that are happening besides the one that I've already mentioned that are taking a hit for time. When I'm looking at the delete columns function, what's happening is immediately there's a transpose happening. And so when you're transposing 1,000,000 records, and let's just say that there's 100 columns of data, what you would be doing is you'd be creating one record per field. So that would be 100 times 1,000,000, 100 million records. And you're going to go and put those 100 million records into a summarize. That's a lot of data. And when you're working with large volumes of data, this is going to be a performance hit for you. It works tremendously well with small sets of data. But what we're going to want to do is rethink the deletion of columns logic. Hey, the deletion of rows has the same transpose happening in it. And so we want to be able to not do that with our data. And we're also going to have joins inside of that processes, multiple functions that are going to potentially slow you down. So when you're looking at the original code, and I've added these little formula indicators to make it a little bit easier to know that these are multi-field formulas, you're running into a multi-field formula that's going to be asking every record, do I need to do something with you? And you're going to do that almost a dozen times. And so you're going through every bit of logic. So the first premise, the first slide that I showed you said, don't do that. Let's only execute logic when you need to. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a detour. So when the GUI is saying, I want to replace with blanks, it's going to update the value in a detour. And so if there's something to actually do, then you're going to come into the logic. If there isn't something to do, you're going to come down this left side and avoid all logic. So there's no overhead for the record itself when it comes through the detour. It's only the overhead is applied when the detour says, I need to do something. So we take a quick look at some of the expressions that are being used in those multi-field formulas. And we find that they're using regular expressions, which are very useful when you're looking at unstructured data. When you look at structured data, now you're carrying the overhead of doing something on unstructured data to structured data, and that might prove to be expensive. And in the example that we have here, we're running 1,000,000 records through a regular expression to remove numbers. So let's take a look at that function. It's regex replace the current field. Anything that's in the values of 0 through 9, you're going to replace with nothing. And that takes 7.8 seconds. An equivalent string function is replace char. The current field, you replace 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Any of those values, replace it with nothing. And you're able to go and reduce the time that it takes to execute this, which admittedly includes the multiplying of one record into 1,000,000 records. But you see the performance gain that's happening when the exact same function is applied to the data. So the way that this is going to work inside of the code is that it's going to say if the current field name, because you're going to look at all the fields, is in fix me. And fix me is just a name that I gave to the function of the formula, and is null the current field, then, and then we can see that we've put in comments here the regex replace, and instead of that I've got new code replace char, else current field, and if. So let's take a look at that again. The fix me, I'm going to substitute all of the needed fields that you've selected. I'm going to put that into a list. So if the current field name is in, account number, or date, or whatever the values might be in your incoming data, this fix me is going to get a list of variables. I use 2 ampersands. It's just old school. You could just put in the word and. And not is null, the current field. So if the current field isn't null, then do this work. Admittedly, when I take a look at this, if it is null, I don't need to do the replace char. I don't know, I haven't tested which is more expensive, testing for nulls or trying to replace chars against a null field. So this might be, as I'm making this recording, tweakable to run even faster. So where the magic happens, I had gone through the regular expressions and then started to get into the logic of the delete row and columns that are empty. And then I started engaging other Alteryx aces, asking them, do you happen to have you built and decided instead of using somebody else's code inside of this, I was going to go and try to build something with some help that would work faster. So the thought came about, what am I doing in English? Forget Alteryx. What am I trying to do when I'm trying to delete rows? What I'm doing visually is I'm checking the value of each field across a row to make sure that every single necessary field is empty or any one of those fields has a value. So I want to filter out unwanted rows of data. I don't have to transpose the data. That being said, this is the type of formula that I'm looking for. Is null field 1 and is null field 2? I'm looking for something where every field listed is null. Well, here comes some incoming data. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the field information to get a whole list of what are all of the columns of data. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take those names and I'm going to create a list of names. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an expression so that I can feed that into, and this is another Crew macro, it's a dynamic formula macro. And I'll actually, with the dynamic formula macro, be able to generate a formula at runtime that tests out exactly what I've got on the screen is null. So instead of transposing the data, I turn the data column names into a formula. And then I come up with a decision at the end of that formula of a drop indicator. And if the drop indicator is true or false, I can then use a filter to then keep or drop the fields, the records. Now in deleting the metadata, and we will take a look at this in Alteryx, in deleting the metadata, not deleting the metadata, in deleting columns, I wanted to operate on metadata. So what I'm going to do is I know that I'm going to, for every column of data, have to check, am I all null or not? And so what we'll do is we'll pay the price once with one summarize tool to count the non-null data. So 0 is bad in my comment, but it's actually good in the fact that I don't need to delete you. But if the non-null is 0, that means it's all null. And if it's all null, I'm going to want to get rid of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create one record that contains is field 1 all null, field 2 all null, field 3, 4, 5. And then I've got to then actually transpose just that one record with all the fields on it and say which of these are bad, which of these only have null values. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a field name that's like drop me, I'm all null. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create that and use it in a dynamic rename tool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say field 1 turns into field 1 is all null. And when I put that into the rename, I now have changed, altered all the field names consistently that I want to drop. I'll use a dynamic select later to say if your name conforms to this dropping standard, I'm going to drop the column. Testing. This macro required a lot of testing. As much as I was trying to keep things the same between the existing macro and the new macro, it just required a lot of testing. What happens if the field name has a space in it? If I only choose one function, which one function am I choosing if I'm testing multiple functions? And so I needed help, and I needed a team to be able to do this. And I want to go and describe my opinion as to why to keep development and testing separate. It's not that they're completely separate, but that they require different skills. And so QA does more than just testing. They were there checking, do I actually have all the functions I needed? What does the GUI look like? Is it working? They're really take into account more than just do the expressions that are inside the code run fast. While I was doing this, I was doing other things. And so development is multitasking. QA is just one more thing to do. And I tested with bias. I know that I wasn't fully testing. I was testing what I expected to work. I tested that. And what I expected not to work, I tested that. But then there was this whole world of things that I didn't think about testing. And that was my unintentional bias. QA performed by developers slows time to market. I like to consider myself a developer. And the more QA I'm doing, the less development I'm doing. So in a given amount of time, I can only do so much development because I've got to do so much QA work. So let's keep those functions separate, but let's use agile teams and let people who are sometimes developers be testers on certain functions, to do peer reviews. There's a lot of things that happen in the team, and it's really a shared accountability that the project itself works. So these are the fellow aces that helped me out. AJ Alberto insisted for his participation that I put another function into the cleanse macro that was in one of the older versions of the macro. So as a nod to that request, you'll see that there's an HTML tag removal inside of this version of the cleanse macro. Where to find the macros? At Chaos Reigns within are the original sets of macros, and since I've taken over the Crew district is now part of the ACE district, and you can find them in gallery.alteryx.com. I'd like to, as I state here, see them one day become their own Crew district, but right now they're within the ACE district. And let me quickly bring you over to chaos drains within, you'll see that there's the home page has the blogs, and you'll see the crew data cleanse is the most recent macro as of Christmas 2020. The macros themselves are available here for download. The newer macros are part of gallery.alteryx.com. You'll find crew cleanse, and here there's a reference to the crew macro pack. This crew cleanse does include within it that dynamic formula macro, but I do recommend installing the crew macros first if you haven't already, and then installing the crew's cleanse by creating a new directory somewhere on your computer that won't get deleted, and to go and install the macro there by unzipping first, leaving your zip program aside, and then pressing the install application. If you did see that bit.ly at the beginning of the video, it brings you to a short article that's in the community. I would ask if you have any comments to the crew macro, the crew cleanse, that you come to this, and I'll show you that bit.ly one more time or put it into the notes. So that's the end of this presentation on PowerPoint, and now I'd like to go and break into Alteryx for a review